The call came 3 days before my wedding. I was standing in the kitchen of my condo in Vancouver, half-dressed, eating peanut butter out of the jar, because I hadn't had time for a proper meal in 4 days. My phone lit up on the counter, my father's name. I smiled and answered it, expecting something about the rehearsal dinner, or maybe a question about where to park at the venue. Instead, his voice came through the line, sounding careful, measured, the way he only ever sounded when he'd already made up his mind about something and was simply informing you of the decision. "I won't be walking you down the aisle," he said. "I'm sorry, but your brother needs me right now." I set down the peanut butter. He explained that my brother, his golden boy, the one who had been handed a VP title at the family's development firm the same week I graduated with my CPA, was in the middle of a complete breakdown. His marriage was falling apart, his wife had moved out, and apparently, the idea of watching his younger sister get married in a full church while his own life was crumbling was something my father had decided he simply could not put my brother through. "You understand," my father said, "it wasn't a question." My mother's voice came from the background. "You can walk with Ethan, Leah. Couples do it all the time now. It's modern. Nobody will think anything of it." I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming, the neighbor's dog barking 2 floors down. I remember thinking, they have rehearsed this conversation. They knew exactly what they were going to say before they dialed my number. I asked my father if he understood what he was telling me 3 days before my wedding. He sighed, "Don't make this bigger than it is." My mother took the phone then. She told me my brother was fragile right now, and that family came first. She told me the wedding was one day, but my brother's mental health was a long-term crisis. She said the words mental health in the tone people use when they want to make an argument unanswerable. I told her I heard her. I told them both I would see them Saturday, then I ended the call. I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I stayed there for a long time, not crying, just thinking. Here is what my parents didn't know about me. They thought I was a mid-level accountant at a boutique firm in downtown Vancouver. I had let them believe that. For years, I had let them believe I was doing fine. Not great, not exceptional, just fine, because the truth was something I had been protecting very carefully. The truth was that I was a managing director at one of the largest private credit firms in the country, operating out of our Toronto office. I had spent the last 6 years quietly building a reputation on Bay Street for acquiring distressed commercial real estate debt. I was good at it. I was very good at it. And my family's development company, the one my father had built over 30 years, the one my brother had been handed on a silver plate, was drowning in exactly the kind of distressed debt I knew better than almost anyone in the country. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I had never told my family about. Her name was Ruth. She was 71 years old, and she had been the original co-founder of my father's development firm, back when it was just a small land acquisition company, operating out of a second-floor office in Burnaby in the early 90s. She had built the systems, she had cultivated the municipal relationships. She had spent 8 years turning nothing into something real. And then my father had pushed her out. He had used a shareholder agreement she hadn't fully understood at the time, drafted by a lawyer she later learned had a prior relationship with my father, to dilute her stake, freeze her out of board decisions, and ultimately force her to sell her shares back at a fraction of what they were worth. The whole process had taken less than 4 months. Ruth had spent 2 years trying to fight it in court and had eventually run out of money to continue. I had met her by accident at a property conference in Calgary 7 years ago. She had recognized my last name. I had recognized the story, and over the course of that week we had both recognized something in each other that most people never find: a shared patience. An understanding that the right moment to correct an injustice is not the moment right after it happens, but the one you have quietly been preparing for all along. For 4 years, Ruth and I had been working together. Her investment vehicle, a real estate credit fund she had rebuilt from nothing after being pushed out of my father's company, had quietly become one of the most active buyers of commercial mortgage debt in Western Canada. When my father's company had started overextending itself in the Vancouver market during the pandemic years, maxing out construction lines of credit and refinancing through increasingly expensive private lenders, those lenders had eventually sold the debt. Ruth's fund had been there every time. She now held the majority of the secured debt against my father's 3 largest projects. She held the mezzanine financing on the Burnaby Towers. She held the bridge loan on the North Shore development. She even held the second mortgage on my parents' house in West Vancouver, the one with the Japanese maple in the front yard that my mother had bragged about at every dinner party for 15 years. My father had no idea. I called Ruth the night after my father canceled. She answered on the second ring the way she always did. I told her what had happened. There was a pause, then she said, "So it begins Saturday." I told her yes, and I asked her if she would walk me down the aisle. She said she would be honored. Ethan was waiting up for me in the living room when I finally came out of the kitchen. He took one look at my face and didn't say anything for a moment. He just pulled me onto the couch and sat with me, his hand over mine. He already knew everything. He had spent 3 years helping me map out the legal structure of what we were doing, because Ethan was a restructuring lawyer, and he had a gift for the kind of quiet, methodical precision that this had required. He asked me if I felt any guilt. I looked at the lamp on the side table, the one we had picked out together at a Sunday market in Kitsilano, an ordinary, unremarkable thing that we both loved for no reason we could explain, and I thought about my high school graduation. My father hadn't come because my brother had a hockey playoff game that weekend, and my father never missed those. I had walked across the stage alone. I had taken my own photos on the steps of the school. I had driven myself to the restaurant where my parents eventually met me for a late dinner and spent most of it talking about how my brother's team had nearly made it to provincials. I told Ethan I had run out of guilt a long time ago. The morning of the wedding, the sky over Vancouver was that particular shade of pale blue it gets in late September, when the summer heat finally releases its grip and the air turns honest. I stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite while my best friend pinned the last of my veil into place. My phone was silent, no message from my father, no good morning from my mother, nothing. I didn't expect anything, but you never quite stop expecting it, not entirely, until you do. Ruth arrived at 11:30. She was wearing a charcoal suit that had been tailored in a way that made her look exactly like what she was, a woman who had built and lost and rebuilt, and come out the other side quieter and more formidable than before. She took my hands in hers and told me I looked like someone who had already won. I linked my arm through hers and we walked to the doors. The ceremony was held in a restored heritage chapel in Gastown, exposed brick, tall arched windows, 140 guests. My family was seated in the front pew on the left, my father in a charcoal suit too formal for the occasion, my mother in a champagne blazer that had probably cost $3,000, my brother beside them, and beside him my sister-in-law, who had apparently shown up despite the so-called emotional crisis my father had cited as the reason he couldn't walk me down the aisle. I noted it carefully. The doors opened. The room turned. And the look on my father's face when he saw Ruth on my arm, when he really saw her, when the recognition hit, was something I had imagined many times but had never allowed myself to quite picture until that moment. He went the color of old concrete. Ruth walked beside me with the slow, deliberate ease of someone who has earned the right to take up space. She didn't look at my father, she didn't need to. Her presence was the message. My brother stared. He had been young when Ruth was pushed out of the company, too young to know the details, but he had heard her name at the dinner table enough times to know that the woman walking his sister down the aisle was the last person my father ever expected to see in this building. My mother looked like she was calculating how to explain this to her friends. We reached the altar. Ethan was standing there with the kind of expression that meant he was holding something very close to the chest, but he looked at me first, before anything else, and in that look was everything I needed. Ruth placed my hand in Ethan's. She kissed my cheek. Then, rather than stepping back to a secondary pew, she walked calmly to the front row and sat down in the empty seat directly beside my father. My father shifted. My mother pretended to look at the flowers. The ceremony was beautiful. Our vows were simple and specific. We had written them ourselves, and we had agreed not to make them grand. We talked about showing up, about choosing over and over, about building something real. When the officiant pronounced us married and Ethan kissed me, the room exhaled. During the recessional, as we walked back up the aisle, I allowed myself one look at my father. He was staring at the floor, his jaw was set. He looked like a man who understood in some animal way that something had shifted in the world, but who hadn't yet worked out the shape of it. Ruth had spent the ceremony sitting very still beside him. She hadn't said a word, she hadn't needed to. The reception was at a private room in a restaurant on the waterfront, floor-to-ceiling windows, the inlet just beyond the glass, the mountains going gray in the late afternoon light. It was the kind of view that made guests forget what they were supposed to be talking about. It was there, during the cocktail hour, that my mother found me. She pulled me into the corridor with a grip on my elbow that she would have described as firm and I would describe differently. She wanted to know who Ruth was. She wanted to know why I had humiliated my father. She used the word humiliated 3 times in 4 sentences, which told me something about where her priorities sat. She told me I had ruined the most important day of my life out of spite. She told me my father had given me everything and I had repaid him with public embarrassment. I looked at her. At the expensive blazer, at the earrings my father had bought her, with money he had borrowed against a development project that was now 6 months behind schedule, and I said, "You told me to walk alone. Remember? You said nobody would think anything of it." She opened her mouth. I said, "Go back inside and enjoy the dinner. There's a very good salmon course. After tonight, a meal like this is going to feel like a special occasion." She stared at me. I walked back inside. Ethan was waiting near the window with 2 glasses of sparkling water. He leaned down and said quietly that Ruth had confirmed everything was in order. The formal notices had been prepared. The credit fund's lawyers had filed with the BC Supreme Court that morning. The enforcement proceedings on the secured debt were now a matter of public record. Come Monday, my father's company would not be able to draw on any of its operating lines. It was after the main course that my father stood up uninvited and walked to the microphone at the front of the room. The room quieted out of politeness. He spoke about legacy, about what it meant to build something lasting, about the company he had founded, and I noted the word he used, founded, not co-founded, and about the values he had tried to instill in his children. He paused, looked at me, and said he was proud of me in the way people say they are proud of you when what they mean is, "I am extending you a courtesy right now." He said he hoped I would remember where I came from. He sat down. Then Ruth stood up. The room didn't know who she was. To most of the guests, she was simply the distinguished older woman who had walked me down the aisle. They had no reason to know otherwise. She walked to the microphone without hurrying. She adjusted it to her height. She looked out at the room with the calm of someone who has given a great many speeches and understood that the ones that matter are delivered quietly. She said, "My name is Ruth. I co-founded the company that Leah's father just took sole credit for building. I built its land acquisition systems, cultivated its municipal relationships in Burnaby and Coquitlam, and spent 8 years making it profitable before I was removed from the board. Through a shareholder agreement I was not given adequate time to review. I didn't come tonight to relitigate history. I came because Leah asked me to walk beside her, and because I have spent 30 years watching this family confuse appearance with substance." My father had gone rigid. My mother was gripping her napkin. Ruth explained, in plain language, what a private credit fund does. She explained that distressed commercial real estate debt, the kind a development company accumulates when it overextends, when it refinances through expensive private channels because the chartered banks have started asking harder questions, is exactly the kind of debt that gets bought and sold quietly between institutional investors. She said she had been buying my father's debt for 4 years. She said she now held security over every significant asset his company owned. She said that enforcement proceedings had been filed that morning and would be served to the company's registered address on Monday. She said it without raising her voice. She said it the way you state a fact you have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. The room was absolutely still. My father pushed back his chair and stood. He pointed at Ruth and said she was lying, that her removal from the company 30 years ago had been entirely legal and entirely warranted, that he had built everything under that company's name, and that nobody in this room should believe a word she was saying. Ruth waited for him to finish. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her charcoal jacket and placed a single folded document on the table in front of her. She said, "The filing is public. You can look it up tonight." My father stared at the document. My mother made a sound I hadn't heard from her before. My brother stood and said quietly, "Dad, is this real?" The question in his voice was the kind that doesn't expect a reassuring answer. I walked to the microphone then. I stood beside Ruth and spoke to my father directly. I told him I had spent 6 years building the expertise to do exactly this. I told him that Ruth had provided the capital, and I had provided the knowledge of his financial habits, because I had grown up watching them, because I had understood from a very young age that the image my parents maintained was built on leverage, and that leverage has a due date. I told him his company's operating lines would be frozen Monday morning, that the Burnaby Towers project would move into receivership unless he could arrange full repayment by the end of the month, that the second mortgage on the West Vancouver house, the one with the Japanese maple in the front yard, would also be called. My father opened his mouth to say I was disinherited, to say I was cut off, to say I would get nothing from him ever. I looked at him and said, "There's nothing left to inherit, Dad, there hasn't been for a while." He sat down. My mother turned to him and began to speak in a rapid, urgent whisper that was not quite quiet enough. She was asking about their line of credit, about the mortgage, about the West Vancouver house, about where they were supposed to go. He had no answers. My sister-in-law, who had sat through all of this with the expression of someone watching something from a safe distance, quietly put her hand on my brother's arm. He didn't move. I walked back to my seat. Ethan took my hand under the table. The salmon course was still warm. Later, after the speeches were done and the dancing had started, our guests had the grace to keep celebrating, because this was still a wedding. I slipped out to the terrace alone for a few minutes. The inlet was dark and still. The lights of North Vancouver reflected in long ribbons across the water. The air was cold in the way it gets in Vancouver in September, clean and sharp, like a window being opened. My family did not come out to find me. My father had left the reception shortly after Ruth's speech. My mother had followed. My brother had stayed, and he had come to me before the cake was cut and said quietly that he didn't fully understand what had happened tonight, but that he was sorry for a long time of not paying attention. I didn't forgive him in that moment, but I told him that was a place to start. I thought about what my parents had said on that call 3 days ago. "You can walk alone. It's not a big deal." I thought about all the dinners where my brother's accomplishments were recited like scripture, and mine were received with polite, thin smiles. I thought about the company my father had built on the foundation Ruth had laid, the one he had been taking sole credit for in public speeches for 30 years. The water below was very still. Ruth found me on the terrace a few minutes later. She stood beside me and looked at the water. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it, honestly. "Like I can breathe," I said. She nodded once. We went back inside together, and I danced with my husband until the venue lights came up at midnight and nobody who mattered was missing, and the mountains were still there beyond the glass where they had always been, patient and certain and entirely indifferent to anyone's performance of wealth or power or love. That, I have learned, is the nature of things that are actually real. They don't require an audience.